Hello, welcome back for another edition in our Civil War saga as we are going to be looking at the Western Front of the war. Just to review, our Eastern Front was one prolonged single conflict. We have the Army of Northern Virginia, which was the Confederacy, and the Army of the Potomac, which was the Union Army that fought out most of their battles across Virginia. The Confederacy sees a lot more victories on the Eastern Front. We talked about several of those, and there are several of the others mentioned in your text. And it's also where the Confederacy has their greatest generals. Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson were both present on this front, and their leadership helped the Confederacy on this front of the war. Now, as we look at the war in the West, this is two campaigns. We have one focused on the Mississippi River and the other focused back and forth across the state lines between Kentucky and Tennessee. The Union does have more victories on this front that were substantial for them. This is also where we will see today victories coming to Ulysses S. Grant, and then also we'll look more at William Tecumseh Sherman and his victories in our final section as we bring a close to the war. Both of these fronts are going to be very tough and bloody. Neither was an easy conflict for either side, and so we will continue to look at that. The Mississippi River Campaign is focused on the river and the rivers that contribute to the Mississippi, and we see this as part of Winfield Scott's initial Anaconda Plan to capture the Mississippi River to split the Confederacy into two parts, away from the Deep South, and then to split off Arkansas, Louisiana, and Texas from the rest of the Confederacy. And so that was part of that goal from the initial plan that we talked about earlier in this chapter. The Confederacy's plan to hold on to the Mississippi River was focused around four forts that they had and controlled and wanted to keep control of as they looked to use the Mississippi River to continue to get supplies into regions of the Confederacy. The Union also sees that those forts are what they need to take to accomplish their goal of splitting the Confederacy and also assuring that they could use the Mississippi to get supplies out of the Midwest farming regions. Now, to start off, we're going to do a little profile here of Ulysses S. Grant. Grant was born in Ohio. He was actually born Hiram Ulysses Grant, so that made his initials HUG, and so to have the initials HUG didn't work so well for him at West Point. It's fortunate for him at West Point that someone submitted his name incorrectly and just listed it as Ulysses S. Grant, and so he went with that for his name. We'll talk more about his efforts later on also. At West Point, he was a great horseman. He will go on to, like many others, serve in the Mexican War, but resigned shortly after that and returned to civilian life, but will volunteer again when it comes to the Civil War. He's promoted up through the ranks to end up being the head of all the Union forces as we come to the closing years of the war. And due to his proven leadership, the victories he saw, he came to this high place in command and then eventually is elected as the 18th President of the United States. Now, also we want to focus on some tools of war that's going to make quite a difference on this front and on all fronts. The gunboats are used especially on the Western Front as they allow along the Mississippi for the Union troops to move more closely to the forts and inland areas that would not have been possible without these small gunships. And Ulysses S. Grant will use these to his benefit greatly throughout the conflict. And also we have the mini bull. This was a very accurate bullet with new guns that were in place. The grooves on the bullet worked well throughout these new rifles and hit their target very accurately. And it was was impactful to see what the mini ball does to a human body. This does make the war more deadly with these bullets. If you were hit in a limb by one of these bullets, often it had to be amputated. If you were struck in the torso or head, you were pretty much a goner. There was very little chance of survival. Very few people survived that. The bullets, once they enter the body, do bounce around in breaking things, tearing up organs, and so they were extremely deadly. You'll see some of that as we look at America, the Story of Us. They have a great segment on that, so check that out. Now, as we see these forts being attacked, we'll see Grant capture Forts Henry and Donelson. It was after his victory there that he got his nickname, Unconditional Surrender Grant, playing off of his initials also, that he would accept nothing but unconditional surrender as he's moving through these forts. Island number 10 is another fort that will fall, so 3 of the 4 are under Union control at this time. In addition to these forts falling, the Union Navy is also able to capture New Orleans. The significance of New Orleans, being the South's largest city and its most important seaport, was a hard fall for the Confederacy to lose this key place. This had been a key port throughout the Spanish and French holding of this land before the Louisiana territory was sold, and so it had a long history and had held on as long as it could throughout this conflict. The final obstacle for the river control was Vicksburg. It did have to its benefit that it was a fortress, natural fortress, and that it was built on high bluffs, surrounded by a swamp, and both the Confederacy and Union see this as the last hope for their cause. So Vicksburg here is on the border between Louisiana and Mississippi. So Grant has his troops dig canals to move the boats closer to the city and surround it. Vicksburg is surrounded and under siege from May to July 4th, 1863, when it finally does surrender. In this time, under siege, the people had gone to living in caves, were so desperate for food they turned to horses, dogs, cats, rats, anything to survive. And this surrender came one day after Gettysburg. Gettysburg had been fought July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd of 1863, so this was a major victory on the Eastern Front and then another on the Western Front. And so the Union has full control of Mississippi. Now, the people of Vicksburg were so affected by this collapse of their city that they refused to celebrate Independence Day from 1863 to 1945. They finally do celebrate it again after, in the midst of World War II. The other front was the Kentucky-Tennessee campaign. Kentucky's loyalties had been very divided. They were a border state. We'll look at that in our next section. But the Confederates were looking here to raise troops, wanted Kentucky to secede and come into the Confederacy, and wanted to do everything they could to stop the Union campaign on the Mississippi. So both of these fronts are working all at the same time. Now on this front, we see that the Confederate and Union forces move back and forth between Kentucky and Tennessee, and this breakthrough comes at the Battle of Chattanooga when the Union forces are finally able to open the door for the invasion through Georgia, through the heart of the South, to help bring an end to the war, and we'll look at that in our final section. So you can see here several of the battles back and forth across this line, and then with Chattanooga ending, opened up Georgia. Now, just to take a few minutes to look at a few interesting aspects of life on the front, we'll start out with medicine. So this is a Civil War medical kit, very close to what we would have seen, if not the exact one that we would have seen as we went to on the field trip. But this is a kit here, several of these tools used for removing limbs. This is a bone saw that was often used, a tourniquet to try to bring about the end of someone's limb. There was no anesthesia available, little hygiene, also a lot of wiping off utensils on a sheet or the apron of the doctor and then going on to the next person with little regard for that. A lot of infection happens because of that, so we have a lot of people dying from disease. When you lost a limb, there were sometimes prosthetics that would be created. This arm is similar to others. Some might have like a fork situation on the end of it so that you could stab at things. But trying to accommodate for that, sometimes you could be sent back into battle with these prosthetics. Another here was often a leg that could be tied to your stub, and it could be adjusted for your height to make it easier for you to walk. So just a couple versions of that here. Another part of life in the camp was a lot of bugs and disease are here. People often turned their coats inside out when they put it to the ground, and then they would have their coat where they could shake off the bugs as they marched throughout the day. The conditions, you basically put your things down wherever it could be. You might unfortunately land in some excrement from someone else or from an animal, so you had to be careful about that. Another problem that they had was their water. This is a canteen. They would dry up and it would cause cracks, but if you soaked it in water, it'd fill up those cracks and you could have water throughout the day. The problem was in the camps, they often put their latrines for bathing and their bathrooms upriver, and then their water jugs downriver. So all of that flowed into their water supply, often making people very sick from that. It took a long time for them to figure out that it would be better for them to switch those situations. Another thing that often took place was people trying to get themselves sent home. This was not, these 3-month commitments they initially made has not been what they wanted. As the war extended on, many people wanted to go home. So they started off shooting off trigger fingers often to try to get out of it. Some were sent home, and then they started getting smart on that and would put them into clerical work or other things that did not require that trigger finger. Others that were on ships would try to get themselves sent home by acting like they were dead, so they could be put into a bag and thrown overboard, and then they would cut themselves out of the bag and swim to the shore. So they started on the Navy ships to start stitching your upper lip onto the bag. So the saying, "get a stiff upper lip," was often true. If you're dead and they try to sew your lip to the bag, you're not going to react. But if you're alive, you're going to be jumping out of that bag because that was very painful. And so many people made attempts at trying to get themselves home. So as we leave behind the Western Front, I have a few reminders. Our next section will pick up with life on the home front. So a couple reminders, please make sure you complete Chapter 10 quiz for Frederick Douglass. That is a long chapter, so you want to settle in with that. Excuse me. And so make sure that you take care of reading that, and also make sure you're getting any assignments you haven't turned in already into me so I can update your grades. There's zeros in there right now if I don't have it from you. So this is your time to make sure you get those taken care of before the end of the year. As we're closing out things, all those assignments are due here in May before finals week, so we'll talk more about that later, but make sure you get all those pieces finished up. And again, if you have any questions, please reach out to me. I would love to help, and have a great one. Talk to you later.